Hi, everybody. I wanted to talk a little bit about types of government. And one thing that I don't know if you ever ask yourself when you think about different country is what type of government does that specific country has? We'll talk about different kinds of government, but one way to start this discussion would be for you to pause what you're doing, pause the video for a second, and go to the CIA fact book. There's a link here, and if it doesn't link for you, just Google search CIA fact book and choose a country, any country around the world. Obviously, not the United States. It would be nice to choose a country that you don't know a lot about. And then look what type of government does that country have? What does the CIA fact book say about that government? And you can repeat that on a number of different countries and kind of just get the lay of the land on of what type of governments are there and what countries belong to which category. Roughly speaking, we can divide types of governments into authoritarian governments and then democracies or some sort of republics. And we'll get to talk about those a little bit later, but let's start by thinking a little bit about authoritarian governments. Those are governments that are non-democracies. People who live there do not enjoy freedoms and a lot of the civil and political rights that we take for um, granted. If you look around the world, you can see that there are around 50 countries. If you do that search at the CIA Factbook or any other similar search, you can see that there are around 50 countries that have authoritarian regimes and another 40 or so that have some sort of a hybrid regime. A regime that may not be fully authoritarian, but it's also not a democracy. And if we are talking about 193 recognized countries in the UN, maybe a few others that you can add there. So your number is somewhere around 190 to 200. And so roughly a little less than half the countries in the world are ruled by some sort of fully authoritarian government or some sort of a hybrid government like that. Um, we can look at some of the examples that I'm sure came to all of your heads when you first saw the title authoritarian government, something like North Korea or Cuba. Those are maybe not pure Marxist communism, or they are not Marxist communism, but they are communist countries, and communism is a sort of an authoritarian government. Iran is a theocracy. We have some other countries that are hybrid theocracies. Think about Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, some other countries in Southeast Asia that are not a full theocracy like Iran, where in Iran the religious institutions come on top or rule over the civil the the civil political institutions. But in a country like Saudi Arabia, it's some sort of a combination, so a hybrid theocracy. And then we have countries that have full-blown military rule, that those could be temporary or permanent. In Myanmar, former Burma, that's one example where arguably this is temporary, but it has been going on for some years where the government is the military and the military is the government and they rule with military force. Here are some joint things or characteristics that come along with all authoritarian regimes. For example, they rely on force and propaganda. They do not hold elections, and if they do hold elections, those are not free and fair elections. the opposition is silent or being silenced. Criticism is discouraged or it's not allowed at all. If you look at countries like Iran, you know that there's not a lot of opposition and a lot of um, people that are talking against the leaders, even if they disagree with. You look at a country like North Korea, just by mentioning the name of Kim Jong-un in the wrong way, you could be jailed. Now, a lot of times an authoritarian regimes start because there is a crisis, because there's some sort of a public unrest, and then a powerful person or a party or a group come in and hold power. But um, the problem is that they don't release the power. They don't just come in, clean house, and leave and reinstitute or institute democracy, but instead they stay and they hold power. And then, if you look at the motivation for a lot of those people, there's they're they're greedy, they're after money or other resources, and a lot of times they're purely power hungry and just want to be in power. In order to hold a government like that, the requirement a lot of times is that the population is not just discouraged from speaking up, but they are afraid and they are ruled and controlled and disciplined. And for all of that to happen, you need to have an actual police state. You need to have full blown control over the population. People could be punished, jailed, beaten, even killed if they are violating any of the rules. A lot of authoritarian regimes are poor, and that has to do with a inefficiency in the way that they rule their country, and B, because they are authoritarian, they have less ties with other countries, and sometimes they're being seen as pariahs, as international pariahs, and nobody wants to do business with them. And so this combination of ruling over people who are not free, not motivated to work and produce, a lot of corruption and inefficiency, and lack of international ties and international trade, those countries tend to end up being poor unless they rely on a source like oil or gas. We do see sometimes that they can still flourish. Now, the fact that the country is poor, that doesn't mean that the leaders themselves are poor. If you look at North Korea, this is a country where the majority of people live in absolute poverty, um, hungry a lot of times, destitute in many ways. However, Kim Jong-un, his family, and people who are close to him have lived relatively um, wealthy and good life. So just because the country is poor doesn't mean that the leaders are poor as well. And as I said, this idea of poverty is being fed by and then feed again the international isolation. Now the international isolation ha comes from a number of reasons. Some of it is countries' leaders don't want to be associated um, with an authoritarian regime. Sometimes it has to do with this attempt to put sanctions on this regime, this country, this government, and try to make them change. For those reasons, and for some other reasons as well, you do end up a lot of times with a poor country that is isolated internationally, or at least isolated to some degree, and if you look at all those examples, Cuba, Iran, North Korea, um, Myanmar, you can see those traits there. And then finally, something that we see a lot of times in authoritarian regime or under authoritarian governments is the lack of civil society. So even if there's no direct crash of, say, religious institutions, sometimes there is, but even if there isn't, people are afraid to be active and to do things unless there are sanctions by the government. And so you see less organizations, you see people dealing more with self-survival, a lot of suspicious. If I say something with my neighbor, um, would my neighbor give me up to the authorities? And so that means that the civil society is very weak, the morale is low, there's less organizations, people don't go out to have picnic together, and they also don't go out and protest together. Monarchies are the type of government that comes when there is, a king or a queen or other a hereditary line of government of people who rule the country. They were not elected, but that doesn't mean that they are dictators or authoritarian in nature. They could still be in tune with the people. They could still try and get mandates from the people to things like legislation or have an elected parliament working with the monarch. But generally speaking, you cannot become king unless you were born into the royal family, right? So this is a hereditary line of of ruling. Uh, we have constitutional monarchs, and those are monarchs that mostly hold ceremonial power. If you look around Europe, and you look on the King of England, for example, or um, the royal family in Belgium or the Netherlands, they are part of a constitutional monarchy. The King of England is still the head of state, but his role is mostly ceremonial. He's not sitting there at 10 Downing making daily executive decisions, but he will be sent to represent the country in the Olympic Games. And people do look up to the king and the royal family. Now, the real power in countries in constitutional monarchies, countries that are ruled by constitutional monarchies, lies in the elected institutions. Case of England, it's the parliament, the House, the House of Lords, the Prime Minister. Um, this is where the power really resides. Same goes for the Netherlands, for Belgium. They have an elected government with a prime minister, with a parliament, with the opposition parties, etc. But there still is a king or a queen above everything, um, and they are in a ceremonial role. Now, most of the remaining monarchies in the world fit in this model of a constitutional monarchy. And then we have absolute monarchies. And in an absolute monarchy, the monarch and family has complete power over the country, both the ceremonial and the executive, the day-to-day, the governing power is held by the monarch and the royal family. Sometimes they do share power, but they but still these are not usually popular elected or freely elected institutions that they share power with. In the example of Saudi Arabia, here they share power with religious institutions. Sometimes they do have a parliament, but that parliament is mostly nominated or appointed by the royal family. Um, and they're not really allowing the people to voice their choice when it comes to uh, who is part of the government. If the religion institutions are part of it, then we have this line that the royal family uh, is relying on the power that come from the religious institutions, and those religious institutions in the name of God, in the name of faith, saying, that God gave us the sultan or the emir or the sheikh to, or the prince or the king or the queen, whatever that may be, to rule over us. So we see the roots coming from the religious institutions, and the king or the prince or the sultan serves that arrangement. Now, a lot of times in absolute monarchies, the way that the monarch keep people happy is by having a prosperous country, um, growing economy, good living conditions, so people have good life. Therefore, they are most likely to develop a relationship with the monarchs of love or respect or support, as opposed to trying and focus on political freedoms and on wanting free and fair elections and things like that. So, like it says there, that's where the legitimacy comes. So we talked about authoritarian regimes and we talked about monarchies, and now I want to mention this idea of illiberal democracies. Illiberal democracies, one things that they are doing, and that's where they can claim to be a democracy, is that they hold elections. But most times, or all the time, if it's an illiberal democracy, those are not free and fair elections, and there is no real competition. Sometimes it's because there's extreme limits on who can be a candidate. Um, Sometimes those candidates are handpicked or appointed by the leadership or those that are in power. Sometimes there are elections, but there's only one candidate to vote for. So no real competition in different ways. There's also always also some limits on the opposition. There is a limit on the freedom of speech. There is a limit on how you can voice your dissent. Maybe you can put an ad in the newspaper, but you cannot organize a street protest, or vice versa, for example. Maybe you can have protests, but you cannot run competing candidates. Another hallmark of illiberal democracy is that there are no term limits. We do know, even in fully consolidated working democracies, that there is some advantage for the incumbent. Um, but in a country like the United States, for example, the president could be as popular as anybody ever thought the president could be, but after 2 terms, they have to step down. And so you don't have this idea that somebody becomes too comfortable or consolidate power. In illiberal democracies, a lot of time there are no term limits, and if there were term limits, if you look at Russia, for example, the president that wants to consolidate power, in this case Putin, get rid of term limits. So term limits are a way to keep people from becoming too comfortable and holding power too long, but one way to make a democracy into an illiberal democracy is to get rid of those term limits. So again, this idea of elections that are not free and fair, on top of the already built-in advantage of the incumbent, also the incumbent makes sure to change the rules or design the rules in such a way that continue to favor um, herself and not anybody that might try to run against. So In illiberal democracies, we see some level of civil and political rights. We see some civil and political rights, but less so than what we see in liberal open democracies. And either that or there's just no protections of those civil and political rights. So, for example, there is censorship on the free press. So there is so-called free press, but nothing can be published before the government puts a stamp on it. So that is kind of an erosion of civil and political rights. And in that kind of continuing with this example, in illiberal democracies, we see the government either directly by law or indirectly through money or licenses or permits in different ways have some control over the media. Um, and you can look at countries like Singapore or Russia for examples of illiberal democracies. Now, this idea of freedom, when we move on the line from authoritarian regimes into monarchies, illiberal democracies, and now that we move into democracies, one of the main points or the main things that come with being living in a democracy is freedom. But I want you to hold for a second here again, pause, and think about what does freedom means to you. What does freedom mean to you? There's a typo here. Nonetheless, maybe take a piece of paper and jot down one or two, three things that freedom mean to you. One way to think about it also is what is it, what civil and political right or what freedoms are there that you are willing to go and fight for? That will take you out to the street, that you would say, I need to be heard. Think about it. I'm sure some of you have already participated in a protest. Um, and think about what was the protest about. We've seen in recent years, the Black Lives Matter movement. More recently, a lot of the support for Palestine or support for Israel, support for Ukraine. We see a lot of those different political protests. Um, Women's rights. There's a lot of different causes that get people out there, right? And then ask yourself this question after you've thought about freedom, what is it that you're willing to go out and fight for? Should there be a limit on the power of government, and what should those limits be? This is the link from freedom to human rights, because human rights basically are those limits that we put on the government and say, government is powerful, it's good, it's useful. We had this discussion on the discussion forum number 3. What is the government good for? What is the government not good for? However, at some point, we need to say there should be limits on the power of government, and especially on the people that govern us. And those limits are human rights or civil and political rights. Now, there are ways to measure freedom around the world and to measure how free countries are. And that's basically answering the question of how democratic or non-democratic country is. And that will depend, and we have a mini lecture specifically about democracy, so we'll talk about those things more in detail. But that will depend on the structure and the design, but not only the structure and the design, which usually come from the Constitution, but also on how those things are implemented and practiced. There is an organization that's called the Freedom House, and it is an organization that operates all around the world, and every year it ranks the degree of freedom in all countries around the world. Okay, and the way it works is that a country can get up to 40 points on political rights and up to 60 points on civil liberties. There are specific questions, um, and you can see exactly what are they're looking at. And then the higher the score, the more free the country is. And then they are publishing this map, which is being updated all the time. And you can see for every country around the world, this is a 2022 report, that some countries, like Russia, are not free. I'm sorry, this is the internet freedom. Let's look at the global freedom. Still, Russia is not free, and some countries like the United States are free in green. But if you look at that, the United States has 83 out of 100 points. A country like Canada, to the north of us, has 98 points. Some of the other Western European democracies, such as Norway and Sweden and Finland, have 100 out of 100. Germany at 94, France at 89, the UK at 93, Australia over here at 95, Japan at 96. So the United States is free. We are a democracy. We are a free democracy. But we still have some issues and things that we need to think about and maybe talk about. And you can look at that. There's an internet status, there's a democracy status, which is more specific. But again, if we look at global freedom, the different countries, all the green countries are clearly democracies. The yellow ones, some of them are illiberal democracies, some of them are on the cusp of one or the other. Some of them are just non-democracies. And then the purple ones are clearly non-democratic countries. And then if you was interested, you could enter here and you can see exactly the breakout of the points and or read the full review. I encourage you to play with that a little bit. This is very, very interesting. And you could see also what exactly did the United States lose points on. So for example, on the electoral process, um, because our head of government is not elected by direct elections, and there's some, accusations as such, then only 3 out of 4 points. Um, if you look at a question like, are the electoral laws framework fair and implemented impartially by the relevant election management bodies? Again, our electoral college and the way that we elect our president knock some points off. So you can take some time and play with this and look at the United States or any other country that you are interested in to figure out how free it is. What's important here is that, there are ways to measure exactly um, how free a country is and how democratic a country is. So when we are talking um, about regime types, about government types, then, like I said, we started by talking about authoritarian regimes and moved to monarchies, illiberal democracies, and democracies. And now in this map over here, through the information on the Freedom House, we can see how you can actually operationalize and measure all of those things. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you on the next mini lecture.